The common misconception of the Middle Ages is that it is a boring, backward, kind of filthy period of time in which people died young, when all that you had before you to look forward to if you were born in the Middle Ages was farming for a period of time, usually under a feudal lord, and then essentially passing on by the age of, let's say, 40. And that image of the Middle Ages has been enforced by the way in which many of the comedic and Hollywood stories of the Middle Ages have also played. We've all seen probably the Monty Python stories of the Middle Ages, the Holy Grail stories, where any number of caricatures of the Middle Ages are sort of paraded in front of us. One, Bring Out Your Dead, where it seems that everyone is sort of dying of the plague, and all that is left for those who do not have the plague is to cart around a wheelbarrow and pick up the dead people, and lots of other things like this. And I don't doubt that for many of us, the Middle Ages presents an enigma. That is to say, it's a period in which it's probably safe to assume that we find it to be the Dark Ages. But in reality, the Middle Ages are actually quite exciting. The world is not lacking in hygiene, money, art, medicine, and having a surplus of war, misogyny, superstition, and chastity belts. By our standards today, of course, the Middle Ages are strange. They do lots of things that we're not used to seeing. They have a number of beliefs that are strange and foreign to us. The church looks different to the way it does today in the 21st century. Peasants, the married life, the agrarian ways in which people would live off the land and essentially live hand to mouth in some cases, is something we're not used to sort of experiencing. The authoritarianism of the Middle Ages also strikes us as a bit out of touch. We're so used to the modern concept of liberty and freedom that whenever we find a culture, even a period of time across multiple cultures, where there is what appears to us to be a lack of liberty, or in some cases oppression, we tend to find as not a very exciting place. This is intellectual snobbery. This is chronological snobbery, as one person once put it. Just because something from the past is unfamiliar doesn't mean that it is necessarily strange in the ultimate sense of the word. That is to say, just because something doesn't look like us, doesn't act like us, does not mean that it is somehow inferior. The fact of the matter is, given that we live in a computer age, in a technology age, it makes our world utterly strange to just about any period of time prior to this age. Go back just 3 or 4 generations, and you're likely to find a period of time in which everything seems to be archaic and boring, in which you sort of wonder, what did they do with themselves throughout the day if they didn't have their computers and entertainment and constant communication and all the things that we're so used to having? So we just have to simply acknowledge the fact that the past is going to be strange. Some periods of the past will be stranger than others. But the fact of the matter is that we don't have to look back in derision. And in fact, the Middle Ages are really not all that strange when you actually get into it and look at it. If you just think about it, the number of things that come to us down from the Middle Ages that are cherished today, or that are believed to be exciting and interesting, are numerous. Just think of the development in the Middle Ages of literature. You have the epic Beowulf, Canterbury Tales, stories of King Arthur and Robin Hood. Now, some of these are looked on with suspicion by Protestants, but they are nonetheless important and very, very interesting if we're going to understand the Reformation itself. We have the development of scholasticism. We have Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, all kinds of figures and theologians who shaped the intellectual Western world in the church, and who really were the sources for much of Luther's early training as well as the other reformers. Now, Luther and others would later react against major portions of this period of theological development. But that doesn't mean it's uninteresting. It just means that it's problematic when we look at it through the lens of the Reformation. The rise of Islam as it comes to the West and at times attacks the West directly. And then, of course, the response by the West, heading off into crusade, trying to reestablish the Christian world in the Near East. Think of knights, warfare. There has been a lot of work done on what we call the forerunners to the Reformation. People like John Wycliffe, and the theological movement of Jan Hus. All of these movements shaped and changed and developed and worked against the Catholic Church in many of the same ways that Luther and Calvin and Cranmer and the other Protestant reformers would just centuries later. Historians typically break the Middle Ages down into 3 periods of time. Now, I want to go ahead and caution you that these periods of time are arbitrary in some ways. They are artificial. These are the inventions of historians. But still, no one that lives, say, in the year 1001 would say, boy, this is great that I live in a different period of time than I lived just 2 years ago. The first is what we today call the early Middle Ages, very easily titled. And this runs from 500 to 1000 AD. It's a large period of time. If you're going to describe any period of time as being the Dark Ages, it's probably going to be this period of time, 500 to 1000. The reason why it's sometimes referred to the Dark Ages is not due to any moral decline, not due necessarily to spiritual decline, at least not in the terms of apathy or in terms of church involvement or theological engagement. There were people that loved Christ at this time. There were people who read the scriptures and attempted to understand them in the light of their own day. But what happens from 500 to 1000 is you have a series of wars, you have a series of national calamities, you have obviously the ongoing fallout from the destruction of Rome as the imperial sort of unifier of all of the world, both East and West. And as a result, you have all of these changes that occur in this period of time, the early Middle Ages. It's this period of time in which you see the rise of what would eventually become the modern nations as we know them today. Modern nations being like France and Germany and England. All of these countries, all of these regions began to be shaped during this period of time. Next, we have what is often referred to as the High Middle Ages. This runs from 1000 to 1300. This was the period of time in which the Middle Ages were at its best, that you have a flourishing of art and literature. You have a flourishing of church activity, theological activity. You have the rise and the development of scholasticism, for example, and a number of important developments in theological thinking in the West. You also have more or less the stabilization of certain nations or certain countries in the western part of Europe. This period of time, the High Middle Ages, is the time of the Crusades. It's the time of any of a number of really sort of interesting, but as well as troubling developments in the Middle Ages that have to be understood. Lastly, we have the appropriately named Latter Middle Ages. The Latter Middle Ages run from 1300 to 1500. By and large, the Latter Middle Ages should not be seen as some sort of cesspool of bad thinking and bad morals. Fact of the matter is that the Latter Middle Ages have a great deal of variety and a great deal of developments for us, both positive and negative, that set the stage for Luther and the Reformation. Now, obviously, Luther and others will react against the latter Middle Ages, but they react against the Middle Ages as a whole, and so we can't pin all of the sins of the Middle Ages onto the latter period. The papacy first was co-opted by the French government, and later the papacy itself split into 3 different papacies, 3 different popes. In the end, though, I want you to see that the Middle Ages are actually quite a fascinating period. We will have a better understanding of the medieval world in order that we can have an understanding of the medieval church with the ultimate goal of eventually better understanding the Protestant Reformation, which broke away from the medieval perspective on faith, theology, and the Bible.
Hey, Drive-Thru History fans, happy St. Patrick's Day. Now, St. Patrick's Day in America started in Boston way back in 1737. Since then, it's grown into a popular but casually observed secular holiday, with people wearing green or coloring their favorite food or beverage that color. During the St. Patrick's Day parade in Chicago, a secret recipe is used to literally dye the Chicago River green. Well, to be honest, the river was probably that color already. But in Ireland, where I spent a couple of weeks recently, St. Patrick's Day is very much a religious holiday, as Patrick, the famous Christian missionary and bishop, is widely known as having Christianized Ireland, leaving a legacy as one of the most inspiring of any Christian saint in history. That's why he's the patron saint of Ireland. So we at Drive Through History have been very busy in the past many months, working on lots of projects that we haven't even told you about. Since it's St. Patrick's Day, I want to give you a little peek at a clip from a much larger series we're doing about the dramatic spread of Christianity around the world. Here's a little segment on St. Patrick. To take a closer look at the life of St. Patrick, I figure you gotta go to Ireland. It's just a quick hop over the Irish Sea. Like a rainbow, right into a pot of gold, laddie. Okay, so my Irish accent's not any good either. Patrick was born in Roman-controlled Britain in about 390 AD. But it wasn't long before barbarians from across the Irish Sea raided British coastal regions, taking many captives. Patrick was probably 16 years old when his village was attacked. He was taken captive here to the rugged shores of Northern Ireland, and he was sold as a slave shepherd to a local Druid chieftain. He was forced into bitter isolation, tending flocks as a slave shepherd here on Slemish Mountain. As Patrick faced his first months of loneliness, hunger, illness, and despair here on Slemish Mountain, he began seeking God. He later wrote, "I would pray constantly during the daylight hours, and the love of God surrounded me more and more." After 6 tough years in this area of Northern Ireland, totally relying upon God, Patrick wrote that he had a life-changing dream. The message: your hungers are rewarded. You are going home. Look, your ship is ready. So Patrick snubbed his fear of punishment, left his flocks, and walked 200 miles to the Irish coast, where indeed he found a ship. Patrick the fugitive traveled back over the Irish Sea to Britain. There, he joined a monastery and dedicated the next 20 years of his life to pursuing God and the gospel of Jesus Christ. After becoming a priest, Patrick couldn't deny his heart for the Irish people and his calling to return to them. At this point in history, about 432 AD, Ireland was dominated by full-scale barbarism. Nonetheless, Patrick wrote, "I am ready to be murdered, betrayed, enslaved, whatever come my way." He had to return for the Irish people that he loved. Patrick planted his first church in a barn in Northern Ireland. He went on to spend the next 30 years of his life preaching the gospel all around the treacherous island. In the end, Patrick is credited with baptizing 120,000 people and founding 300 churches in Ireland. St. Patrick's Cathedral here in Dublin is a fitting tribute to his incredible legacy. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, it looked as if paganism might again get the better of Christianity when new adversaries, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, invaded Britain. Yet against the odds, Christianity survived. Missionary activity continued here in Ireland, and starting with Scotland, an Irish evangelist named Columba brought Patrick's style of Christianity to mainland Britain. 100 years after Patrick, Columba was considered the next great evangelist from Ireland. In 563, he put together a team of 12 missionaries, and he traveled north across these treacherous waters to western Scotland, and he founded a monastery on the Isle of Iona. Iona Abbey became the focal point for spreading the gospel in Scotland, and is considered one of the oldest centers for scriptural study in Western Europe. Iona Abbey is still home to a Christian religious order and remains a popular pilgrimage site. During the decades following Columba, followers of the Columba movement continued planting monasteries throughout Ireland and Scotland. Despite growing pressures, the gospel continued to spread. Skellig Michael, or Great Skellig, is the larger of the two Skellig Islands, about 8 miles from the Irish coast of County Kerry. The name Skellig comes from a Gaelic word meaning rock in the sea. Within 100 years of the death of St. Patrick, a Christian monastery was established here as a place of Christian isolation, learning, and protection. The monastery remained in continual use until it was abandoned in the late 12th century. Most of the island and the ruins of the monastery became a UNESCO World Heritage Site back in 1996. The Skellig Islands are also considered important nesting grounds for rare species of birds. And spoiler alert, since 2015, Skellig Michael has doubled as a hideout for a certain Jedi hermit. You know, it's not easy getting to Skellig Michael. Only a few boat operators have permits, and there's only a few-month window during the summer when the weather cooperates. Even then, trips to the islands are canceled if the seas are too rough. The monastery is only accessible by 3 sets of steps, which come right out of the sea. The monks created 3 routes, known as the East, South, and North Steps, so that they could have access during different weather conditions. As you can imagine, this place gets very nasty, even inaccessible during the dark winter months. Today, only these South Steps are open to visitors. The South and North Steps meet here at Christ's Saddle and continue as one to the monastery. Skellig Michael has 2 distinct peaks connected by a flat center part behind me known as Christ's Saddle. Each peak is associated with an awesome archaeological site, both of which are a testament to the amazing engineering skills of the monks. The first site is this main monastery built right into the steep slope on the east side of the island. The monastery complex includes a main church, smaller chapels, graveyard, garden, water cisterns, and these famous beehive huts for living quarters. It was an incredible journey to a truly epic location on our planet. Not only are the natural features stunning, but the historical importance of the place is momentous. Skellig Michael represents an awesome era when monks in secluded places helped preserve Christianity and its biblical manuscripts. Today, this village is known as Saul in honor of Patrick's first barn church here in Ireland. One of the oldest establishments in Saul is Paddy's Barn, a family-run restaurant, pub, and bed and breakfast. It's lunchtime, so history's gonna have to wait. This is Slemish Mountain in County Antrim in Northern Ireland. Slemish Mountain, or Slieve Mish, has long been regarded as the location where Patrick was held captive as a slave shepherd. Slemish Mountain is the plug of an extinct volcano made from mineral-rich dolerite. It has a very distinctive appearance with a steep and rugged top section and smooth, sloping fields surrounding the bottom. The mountain dominates the landscape for miles around. Although usually beautiful and full of wildlife this time of year, Slemish Mountain endures months of wet, cold, and nasty weather. On St. Patrick's Day, large crowds hike to the top of Slemish Mountain as a pilgrimage of sorts. I hear you can even see Scotland from the summit. I have a feeling that's probably not the case today. Let's do this. The work of a slave shepherd was bitterly isolated and strictly enforced. The Druid slave masters were known for their obsession with fear and death. Human heads were impaled on walls and posts as warnings throughout the whole territory. The local Druid priests also demanded human sacrifices to their many gods. Patrick likely observed the ritual of the Wicker Man, where villagers were forced inside a huge human figure woven of sticks. At the end of the ceremony, the Wicker Man was lit on fire, creating a massive blaze that could be seen for miles. This is the awful world that Patrick experienced while fighting off packs of wolves and wild boars on the slopes of Slemish. He later wrote in his autobiography, Confession, "I did not believe in the living God, nor did I from my childhood, but lived in death and unbelief until I was severely chastised by hunger and nakedness." As Patrick faced his first months of loneliness, hunger, illness, and despair here on Slemish Mountain, he began seeking God. But after I came to Ireland, every day I had to tend sheep, and many times a day I prayed, the love of God and his fear came to me more and more, and my faith was strengthened. And my spirit was moved so that in a single day I would say as many as 100 prayers, and almost as many in the night. And this even when I was staying in the woods and on the mountains, and I used to get up for prayer before daylight, through snow, through frost, through rain. There the Lord opened the sense of my unbelief, that I might at last remember my sins and be converted with all my heart to the Lord my God, who comforted me as would a father his son. St. Patrick, Confession. Well, I made it to the summit of Slemish Mountain. To think that Patrick ended up serving 6 long years as a slave shepherd up in these harsh, secluded hills of Northern Ireland. Although beautiful, I can't imagine the painful isolation, alone, with no social contact, no community. Looking out at this stunning landscape, Patrick's story reminds me of another historic figure that served as a shepherd in seclusion during his young life, David from the Old Testament. Scripture tells us that David spent his formative years developing his courage and character alone in the Judean wilderness. While tending sheep, both of these men developed a total dependence on God. In Psalm 63, when David was alone in the desert of Judah, he wrote, "You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you. In a dry and parched land where there is no water. On my bed I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night, because you are my help. I sing in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you. Your right hand upholds me." After 6 tough years in this area of Northern Ireland, totally relying upon God, Patrick wrote that he had a life-changing dream. In Confession, he recalled, "One night I heard in my sleep a voice saying to me, 'It is well that you fast. Soon you will go to your own country.' And again, a voice saying to me, 'See, your ship is ready.' And it was not near, but at a distance of perhaps 200 miles. Then I took to flight. I went in the strength of God, who directed my way, until I came to that ship." Almost immediately, Patrick snubbed his fear of punishment, left his flocks, and walked many days to a foretold location on the Irish coast. He was about 22 years old. Now, tradition tells us that Patrick caught a ship somewhere between here at Howth Head near Dublin and Wicklow Head, about 45 miles south of me. Now, geographically, this is the easternmost region on the mainland of the Republic of Ireland. Patrick the Fugitive traveled back over the Irish Sea to Britain. There, he joined a monastery and dedicated the next 20 years of his life to pursuing God and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Much of what we know about Patrick comes from his own account, Confession. It's rather short, about 6,600 words in the English translation, but it's filled with incredible personal insights. 8 Latin manuscripts survive, the earliest being from the 9th century. Another primary source is the Life of St. Patrick, written by Muirchew in about 680 AD. According to Muirchew and other traditions, Patrick spent the next 20 years of his life in Britain and France, studying at places such as St. Martin's Monastery in Tours and the island refuge of Larens Abbey. He ultimately became a priest, probably ordained in Auxerre, France. After 2 decades, Patrick couldn't deny his heart for the Irish people and his calling to return to them. According to Confession, he had a series of dreams and visions that finally compelled him to return to Ireland. It was about 432 AD. At this point in history, Ireland was dominated by full-scale barbarism, where murder, rape, slavery, and human sacrifice were commonplace. Nonetheless, Patrick wrote, "I am ready to be murdered, betrayed, enslaved, whatever come my way." He had to return for the Irish people he loved. So, let's return to Ireland and see what happened next. According to one tradition, Patrick returned to Ireland through the Straits of Strangford Lough in about 432 AD. Strangford Lough is a large sea inlet on the east coast of Northern Ireland. In fact, it's the largest inlet in all the British Isles, covering nearly 60 square miles. Strangford Lough is almost totally enclosed by the Ards Peninsula and is linked to the Irish Sea by a long, narrow channel. The main inlet is an incredible sight with at least 70 islands and a number of outcroppings, bays, and coves. Tradition tells us that Patrick sailed into Strangford Lough, landing at the mouth of a small river known as the Slaney. Today, this spot is accessible via a road appropriately marked as St. Patrick's Trail. Here, Patrick is said to have met a local chieftain named Daiku, who became his first convert to Christianity. Daiku gave Patrick a barn about 2 miles up the road that became Patrick's first church. So there you have it. Don't let this holiday come and go without appreciating the real St. Patrick, a man whose sacrificial dedication to Christ literally changed the course of history. And did you know why the shamrock is associated with St. Patrick's Day? Because Patrick used the 3-leaf clover, which are all over the hillsides in Ireland, by the way, as a helpful illustration to teach the Holy Trinity: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, 3 in 1. Way better than the elusive 4-leaf clover, which your chances of actually finding one of those are quite literally 1 in 10,000. I looked it up. So I'd get started if I were you. The most famous of the desert monks was Anthony. In about 270 AD, at the age of 20, he sold all of his possessions, gave his money to the poor, and retired to a solitary cave to lead a life of prayer and meditation. Anthony's reputation encouraged others to do the same thing, and many caves were inhabited near him. Anthony never organized his followers into a community, but instead, they all practiced the monastic lives of hermit monks. By the time he died in about 356 AD, thousands of monks had been drawn to the Egyptian desert following Anthony's example. his biographer wrote, the desert had become a city. History reveals that Anthony and the Desert Fathers went on to have a major influence on the development of Christianity. In fact, all of Christian monasticism stems from the Egyptian example in some way. The heartbeat of St. Anthony's Monastery is still the cave that Anthony called home for some 43 years. They've built a stairway and trail that take you into the mountains where the original site is preserved. About 1,000 feet above the monastery. It's also about 2,200 feet above the Red Sea, which on a clear day, they say you can see from up here. And here it is, St. Anthony's Cave. Let's go inside. Anthony's Cave has 3 parts to it. The outer terrace we just saw, the connecting tunnel, and this inner cave where he lived. By the end of the 6th century, there were hundreds of monasteries and thousands of caves scattered throughout the Egyptian desert. A great number of these monasteries are still used today. This is the Monastery of St. Anthony, hidden deep in the Red Sea Mountains, about 200 miles southeast of Cairo. It is considered the oldest monastery in the world.
Organized monasticism appeared first in Egypt under the leadership of St. Anthony the Great, who lived between 251 to 356 AD, and who lived in seclusion in the Mount of the Red Sea for approximately 20 years. Later, he would disciple a large number of ascetics.
There is really one great forefather or founder of the Eremitical tradition, and that is St. Anthony. St. Anthony was a Greek-speaking Christian living in and around the area of Alexandria in the middle to late 3rd century, and on in really to the middle of the 4th century, who decided to perfect his calling by following the example of John the Baptist and Jesus. Now, most of what we know about St. Anthony was not written down by him, but rather was written in a biography by the great Athanasius, the scourge of Arians and the defender of the incarnation of Christ. And Athanasius, for a time, had met with and explored the life of monasticism and seemed to have been enamored by it. And it led to him writing a great biography of St. Anthony. And Anthony, Athanasius tells us, was somebody who decided that he had had enough with society, that he was concerned about pursuing Christ to the fullest, that he wanted to live a life devoted fully to God and to not be wrapped up in the everyday cares of life. And so, Athanasius tells us, Anthony moved to the edge of a desert. The desert was just a number of miles west of Alexandria, and Athanasius tells us that Anthony lived in this desert for about 13 years. Now, the common question that comes up at this point is, well, what did he eat? How did he live? If he's in an actual desert, where's the water? And the short answer is he survived on very, very little. He didn't eat very much. In fact, he was almost always fasting. The little that he did eat was often brought to him by pilgrims or by lay people who would come out to the desert to consult with St. Anthony as a wise man. They would bring him maybe a piece of bread, or they'd bring him some other sorts of things, and he would often sort of sit there and dispense wisdom as they came to him with their cares. And these 13 years were formative for St. Anthony. Tradition has it, mostly through Athanasius, we know that these 13 years were a period of some sort of trial or torment. There are all these stories of the devil tormenting Anthony directly. He sent phantoms of women designed to seduce him. He sent him beasts designed to scare him. And at the end of the 13 years, we are told, the devil actually physically beat St. Anthony to a pulp, nearly beats him to death. He only comes to at some point, and he decides that he has to withdraw from the desert for a period of time for convalescence. And this ongoing tradition of St. Anthony tempted and tormented by the devil is really symbolized by Michelangelo's famous painting of the torment of St. Anthony. You see that the demonic spirit sort of wrapped around him, attacking him and assaulting him. Yet he withstood, even after being physically harmed. He takes on his second monastic period of trial. In this case, St. Anthony moved to an old Roman fort. There were all of these now abandoned forts on the edges of the Roman Empire. Remember, these are the times of the civil wars. This is just on the cusp of Constantine's rise to the throne. But nonetheless, in this case, there was an old Roman fort that had been abandoned, and St. Anthony decides to move into it. Now, there is no comfort in this fort. It's a shell of a building, really. But it provides him some sort of boundaries. And we are told that St. Anthony locked the door, he barred the door, he did something that would enclose him in this cell or in this sort of small fort. And there Anthony lived for an additional 20 years. And much that we have of Anthony's sayings, of his wisdom, comes from this period of time when pilgrims would come to the fort, they'd bring a little bit of food. As they would pass the food, usually through a little window, he would stand there as they asked their questions, and the response would sort of be whispered back through the door. And for the next 20 years, St. Anthony is locked in this fort, and he is engaging in ascetical practices of denying oneself, of prayer. Again, there are struggles with the devil, and in this case, we are told he overcomes. He overcomes not by his own power, but he overcomes, we are told, because when he is tempted and when he sees these demonic forces come at him, he responds by saying that they have no power over him, that he belongs to Christ, and that therefore he is not afraid. And the story goes that St. Anthony was then granted God's favor and the devil was forced to flee. So that's St. Anthony. Anthony is, again, a bit of a warrior. In fact, Anthony is historically considered one of the great athletes of God, and that's actually a technical term. Following Anthony and following the description of his heroic exploration of the Christian life, often these early eremitical monastics would be called the athletes of God.
Pachomios of Egypt, who lived between 292 to 348 AD, was a pagan soldier who was captivated by the hospitality of Christians in Upper Egypt, and he decided to consecrate himself to the God of Christians. Pachomios would establish a number of monastic communities and monasteries where monks lived in a communion of love under one roof. Monasticism was taken to the West at the hands of Athanasius, who shared the monastic way with the people of Ireland in one of his exiles. Benedict, who lived between 480 to 546 AD, would start a revival of Western monasticism that would create numerous monasteries.
The eastern and western parts of the Church have had a long history of unity and disunity as Christianity spread around the world. Historians speak of an East-West schism as a singular event that took place in the year 1054 when Cardinal Humbert and some other representatives of Pope Leo IX placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, excommunicating the Patriarch Michael Cerularius from fellowship with Rome. While this was a significant insult to the Patriarch and a blow to East-West relations, the truth is that the schism had been growing for centuries. The excommunication event of 1054 was just one of many factors that caused the eastern and western parts of the Church to drift apart from one another. When Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the language and culture was primarily Greek. However, in time, scholars in Rome and the Western world shifted to Latin as their primary language. As the centuries went on, Christians in the West became less interested in reading theology in the Greek, and Christians in the East never really took to reading theology in the Latin. This language barrier broke down communication between Christians in both parts of the church. The political situation became different too. When the Western Roman Empire fell to barbarian invaders in the 5th century, the empire fractured into several kingdoms, and the churches struggled to maintain unity between the kingdoms. They eventually persuaded their barbarian kings of the truth of Christianity, but the political and church situations in the West would remain largely decentralized. Even the orientation of church leadership took on the form of a monarchy, as if the Pope was the sole king of the Western Church, and his bishops became like princes. It was a different story in the East. The Eastern, or Byzantine, emperor retained a firm grip on the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. The emperor, whose capital was in Constantinople, had a close and vital relationship with the Patriarch of Constantinople and the patriarchs of the Byzantine Church. Christians in the East recognized a college of patriarchs, where the word college is used like a college of surgeons, or the Electoral College in the US, with much equality between equals leading the church. In 754, following years of separation from the Byzantine Church, Pope Stephen turned his attention northward and developed a relationship with the Frankish kings, Charles the Hammer Martel, Pepin the Short, and Charlemagne. The popes, beginning with Pope Stephen in 754 and continuing from that time forward, focused much on France for their political, economic, and military support. This increased the schism between the eastern and western parts of the church. There were some theological disagreements that mixed in with political disagreements to further the schism as well. Ask Eastern Orthodox Christians today what the main theological difference is between them and the Roman Catholic Church, and they will say the Filioque controversy. At the Council of Constantinople in 381, the Nicene Creed was ratified, and the Holy Spirit was described as proceeding from the Father. In 437, the bishops of Spain held a council in Toledo at the behest of Leo the Great, who served as a prominent deacon before becoming the Pope of Rome, to address a Trinitarian controversy that had arisen in the region, and, using Leo's language, they added the Latin word filioque, and the Son, to the creed they ratified. This group of Western bishops explained that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. This became the standard version of the creed in the Spanish-speaking world, and by the 7th century, the French and German translations of the creed included this phrase. The perception in the East was that this exclusively Western council had overreached by taking it upon themselves to modify the wording of a famous creed, whose wording without this phrase had been ratified by an ecumenical council. While these filioque discussions began small, they eventually evolved into a major sticking point in the schism between the eastern and western parts of the church. In the 9th century, both the eastern and western churches sent missionaries to the Slavs in Bulgaria, which was in the middle of the two regions of the church. Disputes broke out as to whether to include the word filioque in the missionary literature or not. This led to a series of councils in Constantinople and Rome about the matter and about who should be recognized as the true Patriarch of Constantinople. Meanwhile, back in the West, the popes in Rome were attempting to solidify their authority over the Western Church among the different barbarian kingdoms. In the process of doing so, they made claims of the Pope's authority over the entire Church, East and West. Naturally, these claims were ill-received by Eastern Christians, who were willing to recognize the Pope as the Western Patriarch, but only as one among a college of patriarchs. By the 11th century, the papacy grew to the height of its political power and made strong assertions of Rome's authority over the entire Church. While Pope Leo IX did not immediately excommunicate Patriarch Michael Cerularius, the Pope signed a document, primarily written by Cardinal Humbert, which authorized the cardinal to take extreme action if an investigation in Constantinople warranted. Humbert hastily placed the bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia and left the city, thus dramatically formalizing the schism between East and West. The Crusades really solidified the schism and caused it to endure because of the poor behavior of the Crusaders in Constantinople and disagreements about who should be in charge of the church in Antioch. What made the schism continue so firmly for centuries was not theological in nature, but the behavior of Western armies raised and sent by Western church leaders to put down the spread of Islam into Jerusalem and territories of the Eastern Church. When the Western Crusaders came to Constantinople to help the church from persecution, they plundered the city and attempted to set up Latin churches there and elsewhere in the East. History would remember the Crusaders more as misbehaving mercenaries than people protecting their Eastern Orthodox counterparts. Throughout the Church's history, Christians have experienced difficulty when it comes to unity. Separated by language, distance, politics, and theology, the Eastern and Western parts of the Church seem to drift apart, despite persistent attempts to keep the Church unified. While there is one Lord, one faith, and one baptism, Ephesians 4:5, Christians struggle to maintain unity in the Church throughout the world.